Craig's story. He was a quiet guy, the type of guy you pictured one day taking a gun out and going on a shooting rampage. He never spoke, just came to the gym in his dull, dingy attire and quietly lifted. From what I saw, he was a 40-something-year-old guy and worked out somewhat to keep in shape. Although he never bothered anyone, I noticed that he was the butt of many insults and jokes at the gym. Most of the members had given him the nickname Pigpen, since no one seemed to know his real name, and he had never conversed with members of the gym. He was quite simply an enigma at the gym. I was young. I'd been lifting for about 4 years or so. I thought I knew everything. Thought steroids were evil, but I was enthusiastic and trained harder than the average gym goer. Our gym, although well equipped, was at the heart of a fitness club. Most of the members were more concerned with their hair and clothing, being coordinated for the gym's social scene. Pigpen simply stuck out like a sore thumb. I thought many times that he may know things that people said about him. It was obvious to me, so I figured that he must pick up on it. The members were cruel. A snicker here, pinched nose there, all in jest of the quiet guy in his drab, baggy clothing. I didn't see it as funny, more like insecure bullying, but Pigpen simply ignored it and kept on. The owner was a friend of mine named Chris. He and I had worked together at another gym. He had been a competitive bodybuilder, but had since gone into the gym business and had a side business refurbishing homes. I usually spoke to Chris a couple times a week when I saw him, usually on the way out after I finished my workout. One such evening, I was at the front desk talking to Chris and some of the other front desk staff. Pigpen was walking by us to leave the gym. As he grasped the handle for the front door, one of the staff made a coughing gesture under his breath and said, "Pigpen!" Pigpen didn't even flinch, but I saw his eyes cut to his right, and I knew he definitely heard it. He walked out of the door without even a hitch. As the door shut, the girl at the front desk said to Chris, "I don't understand why you even let him work out here." Chris looked over at her with a glare and calmly said, "As long as I am the owner, he will always be welcome here. Do you understand?" She replied sheepishly, "Yes." Chris wasn't finished, and I could tell that he was pissed, but he kept his cool and looked at the other two and said, "That guy has been through hell and back. You need to show some fucking respect. Just because your mommy and daddy pay your bills doesn't give you the right to judge someone you cannot understand." He looked completely astonished and embarrassed, and they should have been. I asked Chris what Pigpen's deal was. Chris told us that Pigpen had been a successful guy at one time in his life. Good career, was a competitive bodybuilder, and had pro potential. So I asked, what happened? Chris replied, life. As Chris went on to explain that he had been raised by his father, he had no other family. His mother had died when he was only a toddler. His father had developed a quite rare type of cancer. He had spent every penny he could trying to get medical care for his dad, and kept him comfortable. In the end, his father passed, and he lost a good bit of money. His wife left him, and he had to quit competition. He went through a struggle financially after that, and never really recovered. And then, about 5 years ago, he was just in a car accident and was nearly killed. He was in a coma for several months. The insurance settlement was enormous enough to help pay for his rehab and to get him financially set for life, but not to the point where he was living on the high hog. Just enough to live off. We were all floored. I was speechless. I didn't even know what to say. Chris looked at me and said, "If you ever want to know something about bodybuilding, that's the guy to ask." For several weeks after that, when I saw Pigpen at the gym, I really felt bad. I didn't even know how to look at him anymore. People still poked fun at him, and it made me upset, but I just kept my head down and trained. Then, one day, I was doing chest, and Pigpen was right there, doing some seated dumbbell curl. Never made sense to me how the guy looked like he was big, overweight, but big shoulders and chest. He must have weighed near 280 to 290. I saw Pigpen pull up a long sleeve to scratch his arm. Guess the big fella had an itch, but what I saw was the biggest fucking forearms I'd ever seen on a man. It was lumped with a system of hose veins. I was simply captivated by it. So I walked up to Pigpen after his next set and said, "Excuse me." He turned slowly to look at me, almost as if there was something wrong with his neck. I felt nervous, so I extended my hand and simply said, "My name's Joe." He just looked up to me. His face was almost expressionless. Chris had said he'd gone through all that hard time, but he didn't mention if he was still mentally all there. Then he spoke. A gravelly voice said, "Craig. My name is Craig." It was as if he hadn't been asked his name in so long that he'd almost forgotten what it was then. He shook my hand with the most callous of hand I think I've ever remember shaking. He had a strong grip, and his hands were muscular at his forearm. I asked him, "How do you get your forearm so developed?" Craig told me he went to another gym to train heavy. That was his old powerlifting gym. Most of his forearm development came from heavy deadlifts, rows, and shrugs. He asked me if I ever had done deadlifts. I had, but not on regularly. He looked at me and said, "Gotta do deadlifts, kid." So, you can understand I was young and impressionable, and that next back workout, I hit the deadlifts right away. I was weak at them. I thought 315 was gonna break my back, but I hung in there and pushed, or I should say, pulled. I've noticed Craig had been watching me since I was doing them. After many months of practicing, I got very good at them. I was up to 475 on deadlifts, and my shoulders and traps were growing, and people kept mentioning my forearms. I was so impressed by the results from one simple thing, that I went to Craig frequently to get advice from him. His advice was always so simple. Seemed like it was always too easy of an answer, but it was always solid advice. People in the gym still treated him like shit, but I was always cool to him. He'd helped me out with great advice on many occasions, and in the last year and a half, I'd gotten not only bigger, but much stronger. I was beginning to have the look of an actual bodybuilder, and it was mostly due to the enigmatic man who no one spoke to, except me. Then, one day, as I was walking into the gym, Chris got my attention from his office, waving his hand for me to come over. So I came in, and Chris informed me that the powerlifting gym Craig went to closed. He asked me if I'd spoken to Craig. I said I hadn't seen him for that day. He said, "Okay," and I went back to the gym to lift. I thought Craig must be disappointed his other gym would be closed. I looked back to the front, and I saw Craig talking with Chris. I couldn't hear what they were saying. Chris kept nodding his head. They both walked to a locked set of double doors, where the old broken gym equipment was kept. After about 30 seconds, they both came out and Craig had a 50-pound bar for powerlifting. Craig walked up to me and said, "Kid, you want to do some deals with me?" I responded, "Hell yeah!" We warmed up with 135 each. Craig had the chrome bar, and I used the standard gym bar. I didn't know how long I would last with deads. The most I'd done was 475, and that was one time. Hadn't touched it since. As of late, 455 was about as much as I could do. As we warmed up with 2 plates, I looked at Craig, and the weights looked like toys he was picking up. For me, they were already feeling somewhat heavier. As I finished 405, I was feeling good. I'd nailed 9 reps, which at the time was a good set for me. Craig was still just warming up. As I finished 405, I was feeling good. I'd nailed 9 reps, which at the time was a good set for me. Craig was still just warming up. Then Craig looks at me and says, "Come on, I need your help for a minute." We walk over to the other side of the gym, to the double doors. He goes in and I follow. In the storage room was a myriad of old stationary bikes, rusted bars, broken plates, and snapped cables. I see Craig crouch down and pick up a large object. It looks like a 45-pound plate, but it says 100 pounds on it. He motions his head down to the place he picked it up and says, "Get the other one." I grab the rusty plate, and it's thick and hefty, difficult to carry, but I'll be damned if I let Craig see me struggle with it. I carry it back to where our bars were, and he puts one on each side of his bar. He squats down in front of the bar, rolls it back and forth with his grip, and with a sudden surge, peels the bar from the floor. I can hear the plates rattling as he bangs out 15 reps. I don't know how much weight he had on that bar, but it had to be excess of 600 pounds. I can't let him see me not go heavier, so I grab a 25 and start to put it on the bar. But before I can bend down to slide it on, Craig looks at me, starts shaking his head from side to side. "Kid." He's holding his hand up with 5 fingers showing. I look at him with a doubtful look and say, 5 plates? Seriously? He simply nods in affirmation. So I return the 25 to the tree and grab a 45-pound plate. The whole time thinking, no fucking way. So I get ready to do my set. I shake my head with doubt, and I hear Craig say, "Kid, don't let that bar punk you." Now, I don't know what it was about the way he said it, but I thought, hell no, I'm not gonna let this fucker beat me down. I grabbed the bar. I took a deep breath and cleared my mind, pulled up and back, and the bar came up and slowly ascended. I scraped my shin, and I could feel it hit my kneecaps, but the shit was moving, and I thought I might shit my pants. I stood straight up with the bar in my hand, and let the weight down with a crash. I was psyched. 495 was my new personal best. I looked at Craig and he was actually smiling. He nodded and said, "Very nice." Some people had taken notice to what we were doing. The fitness gym crowd wasn't used to seeing big weights getting lifted like that. I saw Chris walking to us, and he had a yellow rubber-coated 100-pound powerlifting plate in his hands. He looked at Craig and said, "Look what I found." Craig nodded and put the plate on the end of the bar. Chris looked at me and said, "Jay, there's another one in my office. Can you grab it?" I nodded and went to his office and grabbed the bulky plate, returning them both and putting it on for Craig. Chris looked at the bar, then turned to Craig and said, 810. Craig simply nodded. I couldn't believe my eyes. I'd never seen a bar with that much weight on it. Craig stared at the bar. It was a cold stare. He was breathing deeply, exhaling slowly. It was like some meditation. He was going somewhere else. Somewhere deep in his mind they had to draw upon for strength. Onlookers had gathered. There must have been a dozen men and women looking on as Craig squatted down to grab hold of the bar. I could feel my own heartbeat in anticipation. As he methodically exploded up, his face turned into a shade of red that I'd never seen on him. His veins bulged out as far as I thought they may burst. It was an awesome spectacle of raw power, but the even more impressive feat was he didn't only do it one time. No, he repped it 6 times, with finally coming to explosive crash that must have registered on the Richter scale. Craig remained prone for a moment, his breathing more like panting. He slowly recovered and stood nodding his head. He looked over to me and said, "Your turn," pointing to my bar with 495 still loaded. I looked at him in disbelief and said, "Again?" He looked at me and blankly and said, "No, with more." I really didn't think I could do any better than 495. That's my personal best for God's sake. So I grabbed the 25-pound plate and looked at Craig with my eyebrows raised as if to make sure enough weight was to satisfy him. He nodded and I put on 2 25-pound plates, one per side. At this point, I was shitting my pants. No way I could do this. I would try it, but when I failed, I would just have to fail. Craig said something to me that I'll never forget. He said to me with a calm, like a parent to a child, "Kid, that weight isn't shit. There's a lot worse things than that." I stood there for a moment, contemplating his words. Then it hit me. He was right. A weight is a simple, small thing. Life is an unfair motherfucker that will beat you down again and again. It's unpredictable and unyielding. This bar full of iron is just a thing. There's nothing compared to the difficulties of life. I grabbed the bar. I could feel a lump in my throat, and my adrenaline was pumping hard. I took a hold of the weight and tightened my grip and the straps around my bar, becoming one with it. The onlookers watched, but it was like that moment I was by myself, just me and the bar. Like a jolt of electricity, I yanked the bar up. I started to move, but I stalled on my shins. Craig yelled, "Up!" I pulled. I could feel my heels digging into my trap stingingly. It slowly started to move, centimeter by centimeter. I pulled. I could hear people talking, but my ears were ringing. I recovered and stood up. I looked over at Craig. As I looked around, Craig was smiling again and looked at me, saying, "See?" Chris came up and patted me on the back. I was amazed. I couldn't believe I actually did that. Now Craig got up, walked over to the tree, and grabbed 2 more 45s. He slid one on each end of his bar. I looked at him like I was watching a man be led to the gas chamber. Chris looked at Craig calmly, saying, 900 pounds. Just like the old days, brother. Craig grinned and nodded in acknowledgement. Now, there must have been 30 people back there watching. There were odd whispers, people asking how much it is, and others simply astonished that this silent giant possessed such strength. Craig kneeled down in front of the bar. It was like someone bowing to an executioner. Then he stood up. Was something wrong? He reached down and pulled up the bottom of his sweatshirt and pulled it up and off. What I saw was unbelievable. The man was a mass of slabs of muscle and covered in tattoos. Down the backs of his arms were words. On the right arm read, "I am nothing," and on the left, "I feel nothing." His traps were like 2 huge camel humps, side by side on the back of his neck. And he wasn't fat or overweight. No, he was just fucking huge. His body was like his hand, lumps of callous muscles from years of pain and toll in his life in the gym. It was simply unbelievable. Craig adjusted his belt and strapped it back onto his bar. It was very quiet. And then I heard Chris say, "You got this shit, Craig!" And people started cheering him on. I could hear people saying, "Come on, Craig! You got it, bro!" It was amazing. All while Craig was breathing, very deep, very methodically, rolling the bar back and forth in his hands. He stared into the mirror. I don't know what he saw, but his nostrils started to flare, and he looked like he was getting pissed. His eyes started to well up, like he may cry. He stared blankly at a spot on the floor, just in front of the bar. Wherever he wasn't with us. I just imagined he was in a very dark place that his life had taken him, drawing upon a well of emotions, full of hate, anguish, and pain. It was as if he was channeling all that into the bar. He was breathing harder, and he hadn't even lifted the bar yet. He was shaking all over. I looked at his reflection in the mirror and said, "This is nothing for you, brother." He nodded and then growled, "I got this shit." Then it was as if his entire body uncoiled, driven by the hydraulics of his emotion, then lifted the bar, then the bar bent. His traps were spotted with purple spots, through the hue of red as he cried out, "Fuck you!" And the weight stalled. I thought he may drop it, but his eyes closed and his face winced in anguish as the bar moved upwards. I don't know it was the sweat from around his face, but I could have sworn that tears came out from his eyes. The bar travelled further up, until he had a mid-rift. He stood there, and he opened his eyes back up. They were bloodshot, and a tear filled his pupils. It was so dilated, the blue of his eyes was gone, and it was pure black. It reminded me of those videos of a great white shark taking a bite. Then, he and the bar dropped. At first, I thought he may have passed out, but he didn't. He put his hands up to let us know he was okay. People started to fucking clap. I looked around at them, and I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. As he kneeled down catching his breath, I walked up and crashed next to him and said, "That was the most spectacular thing I've ever seen in my life. Nice lift, bro." He was still panting, but he nodded, so I knew he heard me. Then one of the gym tards yelled, "Damn, Pigpen, get off the juice, dude!" I didn't even think about what I was doing. Some 30-year-old yuppie fuck with his Under Armour tank top and a fucked up stick physique, and I grabbed him by his arm as he tried to walk away. He swung around and looked at me in surprise. I looked him in the eyes and I said, "His fucking name is Craig. C-R-A-I-G. Can you spell asshole?" The idiot looked at me in embarrassment and replied in a low tone, "I'm sorry, man. His name is Craig." And he looked at my hand, still grasping into his flesh, and I quickly let go. I turned to look back at Craig. He was sitting on a bench staring at me. He just looked at me and nodded. I nodded back. Craig still went to the gym for about another year. I talked to him frequently about their training and bodybuilding. I often reminisced about the days we did deadlifts. At this point, I was lifting 585 on deads, all because of Craig's tutelage. After that year, Craig disappeared. Chris told me he hadn't seen him, but had heard he'd moved to another state. Craig and I only spoke at the gym. He had no cell phone. I'd never seen his place, and I'd never had any clue on where he lived. But, though I barely knew the guy, I considered him one of my closest friends. The years went by, and I trained hard, and did my first show, and even managed to make it to nationals. I always wondered what happened to Craig. I wanted to talk to my old friend and get his advice, like when I just started out. He always had the simple answers. So many of the training gurus tried to make things complicated, and Craig just had a sentence or two to say, and was spot on with his advice. Then, one day after a workout, I went home. There was a police car in front of my house. I walked up, and there were two officers walking towards me. They asked me if I was Jay. I told them I was. They informed me Craig had passed. I asked how. They told me he died in his sleep. So I asked them why they were telling me this, and one officer replied that Craig had no known family members still living, and that his only will and testament stated that I was his next of kin. I didn't know what to say. They told me they were sorry for my loss, but I didn't really hear them. They got in the car and pulled away. I stood motionless in my yard, and then I snapped out of shock, and I went inside. I called Chris to tell him, and he was saddened by the news. I sat down and reflected on my mentor of young, the guy that no one would understand, the person who people made fun of, and taunted that he had been one of the biggest impacts of my life. He was a man of very few words, and had such a great impression on me. I was very saddened, like the world had just lost something very good, and I didn't even realize it. The next day, I was in a fog. I really had no clue how to act. My co-workers asked me if everything was okay, and I told them my good friend passed away yesterday. Later that week, as I came to grips with my friend's death, I came home to find a mail envelope packaged at my doorstep. I opened it, and it was a letter of several photos. I read the letter, and it was handwritten in pencil on notebook paper. "Dear Jay, if you are reading this, I have died. My life was hard. Very hard. For a long time, I felt empty, and the gym was the only thing I had to remind me that I was still alive. The pain of working out and pushing myself reminded me every day that I was still alive. I have been keeping an eye on your competitive career, and even some of your shows. I'm proud of you, kid. I always wanted to thank you, but I'm not very good at conversation, as you know. I want to thank you for the days we did deadlifts. That one day, I felt I was a human being again. I felt the best I have felt in my entire life. You're a great inspiration to me, at a time when I was losing hope. Thanks for being my friend. You're a good bro. Craig. By the time I finished reading the letter, I was crying badly. I hadn't cried in years, but I was weeping like a baby. I looked at the photos from my shows. They were taken from the audience. Craig had been at my shows, and I hadn't even known it. I guess he was keeping an eye on me to make sure I was progressing and not sitting back being lazy. I don't know why exactly he was there, but he was there. But I'm glad he got to see that. Under the photos was a legal document. It was Craig's will. I read through all the legal jargon, and towards the end, to itemize all the belongings that Craig had left behind. And since I was his only kin, then I would get these possessions. He left a sizable amount of cash, a truck, his house, and his personal belongings in the house. But the last item on the list was the most priceless of all. One chrome 50-pound powerlifting bar. The end.